guys, Lore Master Melkor here, and I'm going to be bringing you a video for Dungeon Mastering a Great Game. I thought what I would do for this, guy, is to share with you the lessons I've learned when it comes to being a Dungeon Master and D&D in general. I won't get to work on some other on some other things like this very soon. I'm actually working on another article for Nerdarchy as well concerning the Prisoner Dilemma, one of the most heated topics of D&D, which boils down to alignments. And I'm still in the midst of making a video on my YouTube channel for getting started with role-playing, which should hopefully be out soon. Just bear with me, guys. Anyway, on to the show. Dungeon Mastering a Great Game. This is it may seem a little obvious to some people, especially if you're Dungeon Masters. It may seem less obvious to others if they're not Dungeon Masters. The biggest question I've received personally concerning this topic is simply, my group is really comfortable with the role-playing side of things, but who's going to run it? And how can I do a game that's like the Critical Role campaign that Matt Mercer streams? However, there always comes a point when you move beyond the published modules and the campaign begins to take on a more organic life of its own, to where it moves past a script in a book and becomes something far more than what it was initially, to where the players are really dictating what's happening in the story. Believe it or not, I used to really turn my nose at published modules. I don't anymore, and there's a reason for that. That's because when you're starting a new group, oftentimes you're starting them with strangers, you don't know their style. You don't know what kind of characters they're playing, and most importantly, you as the Dungeon Master don't know the group dynamic. You don't know how they're going to fit together and act. In that regard, I really liked published adventures for the first adventure for a group. These do provide some great setups, and if you can find a good adventure, it can really get them started, and through this, you can lay the groundwork for an ongoing campaign. But what do I mean by the groundwork? There has to be a connection between adventures. It's not much of a game, in my opinion, when the players just go from published module to published module. They're in one city one day, and when they finish that adventure, they just leap on over to the next adventure in some other city, some other backwater country they aren't familiar with. It's disconcerting. There's no continuity, and in many ways, that's really the key. Continuity. Where the players feel like they're deciding what they're going to do next, instead of just whatever book the Dungeon Master breaks out next. It can be a little bit disconcerting for a player to know that the Dungeon Master is reading out of a book, because all of a sudden that means they're constrained. Like the Dungeon Master will smite them down if they try to depart from the established module, and to an extent that's pretty true. That's why I used to turn my nose up at them. It's because I felt there was a lack of leeway, for example. If it says we're going to the Temple of Elemental Evil, and they don't want to go to the Temple of Elemental Evil, well, you might as well go home. And part of the key here is making the players want to do something you want them to do, without them necessarily feeling like they've been railroaded and being drugged by the nose. Sometimes it's okay to railroad your players, and there are a lot of ways to do that. I think the main thing I start with is that you've got to force the players to roleplay. And that's mainly what alignment is for 5th edition, really what alignment's always been. It's a tool to give players a reason to act in a certain way. In the old days of AD&D, it was put there to spur role-playing, and it just kind of snowballed. So if your character is lawful good, when a situation presents itself, he is prone to act in a good way, or he's prone to act in a selfish way if he's not good. Again, the primary intention of alignment is to spur role-playing, and that's all it's about in 5th edition. Another great thing I always try to do is I always say encourage your players to come up with a long-term goal, or even just a few short-term goals, but as long as there's one long-term goal, it makes it really fun. This is probably the best bit of advice I can give, aside from encouraging your players to come up with a nickname for their characters, or having some silly voices, or backstories, or whatever. This goal could be anything, and your DM will love you for this. We're always looking for a hook. Part of the problem with this is you're going to have to write a backstory, and you're going to have to roleplay. And most DMs like role-playing because it gives you so many more stories, and it makes the campaign a lot more... It makes it a living, breathing world when all the players have an ambition instead of just, I became an adventurer to seek my fortune. That's so boring. That's so fucking boring. For example, let's say Billy is playing Gromgar, the half-orc fighter, and his goal is he wants to take over his ancestral homelands to rule as a king by his own hand. It's a pretty good goal. Pretty good. Or better yet, what about Inigo Montoya from The Princess Bride? He wants to find and kill the Six-Fingered Man to avenge the death of his father. This one's actually really good because it's something oddly specific. yet hard to find. Every time the party goes to a new town, Billy, as an amigo, can say, "I go to the tavern, to the innkeeper, and ask for rumors about the six-fingered man." It's brilliant. You can even have a monster they come across drop a clue about this guy, and then Billy, as an ego, can say, "You guys, we have to find the six-fingered man." Billy can then choose to let the party know about his backstory, or continue to keep it a secret. Alright, another thing. When the players catch you in a lie, you have two options. And part of what you want to do here is not get defensive. If you get defensive, then the players are going to start poking holes in your campaign, and then you're freaking out, and it's not a good time. Your first option is to agree with them. For example, let's say the party is trailing a monster, and for whatever reason, it's just leaving them in the dust. They know they have a higher top speed than this monster. When they ask about it, just say, "Yeah, I know, right? That's weird." And then just smile mysteriously. You'd be surprised how much you can undermine the confidence of your players this way. They're thinking, uh-oh, this might not be what we thought it was. The DM is playing a fast one on us. And secretly you're just scrambling around trying to cover yourself from a plot hole. Another example of this, let's say the player rolls a really good perception, but they can't see in the dark. They rolled let's say they roll a natural 20, and they're trying to see into a dark cave. You tell them, "You don't see anything." You don't tell them you see nothing's there. You tell them, "You don't think you see anything." Because he can't see anything, because he can't see in the dark. I find this works a lot better with borderline rolls. So let's say the rogue or ranger or whatever is looking for traps. And let's say he rolls a 12. Okay. Well, you tell him, "You don't detect any traps." You don't tell him there's no traps. You say, "You don't detect any traps." That means one of two things. It either means A, there's no traps, or there is traps, but he didn't detect them. And it usually means, for most DMs, in my case as well, it always means the latter. The other option, which is by far safer, is to just admit you done goofed. It's a retcon. It might be blatant. It might not be. But it'll get a few laughs and people will understand. Now, sometimes option 2 doesn't always work. Because maybe there was something significant that happened, like a player death or whatever. Sometimes option 2 doesn't always work. And it's, it's alright. Another thing that helps a lot of dungeon masters, from my experience, if they don't want to use published modules, if you're creative enough and you have the creativity, create your own setting. Many people playing 5th edition D&D don't know about the Dragonlance setting, so you're safe there. But Faerun, on the other hand, oh boy, there's a lot of continuity experts out there who know more about the setting than the dungeon master and might correct the DM on details. This can be frustrating, and is one reason I dislike the Faerun setting and for Forgotten Realms campaign setting. I personally prefer low magic worlds like Greyhawk and Krynn, mostly Krynn. A continuity expert could become frustrated as long as you are using that particular setting and that campaign doesn't follow canon. However, there's nothing inherently wrong with using published worlds for your games. I personally am very fond of the Greyhawk and Dragonlance settings, but you might not like those settings for one reason or another. Maybe you're the type of GM who prefers a high magic world where you can explain away any problems as simply a wizard did it or magic. I personally find that a very infuriating reason it's a very infuriating reason in my opinion. Or maybe you aren't familiar with either of those settings. Maybe creating your own living, breathing world is right up your alley. Who knows? Your players might like your world a lot more than that of the existing ones. World building is one of the many reasons being a DM is fun, and it can lead to some fun stories. And if you're really creative with it, you can create an entire pantheon if that's your alley. Like, you get to create everything about this world. I don't mind DMing and publish in already pre-existing worlds. I prefer Krynn a lot, mainly because of the Dragonlance series and how, honestly, it's a really fun setting. Another thing, be descriptive, not clinical. This is a big one for the world building aspect as well as a lot of things if you're using Theater of the Mind. Let's say the party is going through a cold dungeon. Let's take a step further and say that it's the long abandoned ruins of an ancient order of paladins, the Order of Keys. You can spice this up with a vivid description. Your party passes through a poorly lit corridor. The air is stagnant and heavy. It's almost as if you can still hear the long silent screams of the damned. The chill of death takes hold of the passage into the holy sanctum. You are faced with a massive iron doors barring entry into the Cathedral of Keys. The place seems oddly serene, but something strikes you as unsettling. The doors of the cathedral suddenly burst open, and you were faced with 8 slavering, stench-ridden creatures, their skin crawling with maggots, and their teeth yellowed and sharpened to horrible, jagged points. What do you do? What you want to do here is never call them ghasts. You can call them ghasts later after a character succeeds on an intelligence religion check to identify them as such. You don't need to go overboard with this every time they fight ghasts. Like, you don't need to go overboard with the slavering jaws and dripping maws. In other words, you're telling a story. Flare it up a bit in combat. You're telling a story through their perception. Going with the ghast example, describe feeling overcome by a pungent odor that threatens to nauseate you, and feeling as if you have to vomit in this disease-ridden creature's presence. That dramatic flair is insanely poignant, and will encourage your players to roleplay in combat. For example, they might not want to use their good weapons against these things. They might even call them disease-ridden. And again, the disease-ridden part is really, really good. And let's say they're wading through a sewer. You've got to reinforce the shit they're wading through, because they could run into some carrion crawlers or whatever. The main tip that I personally recommend a lot is organization, so being organized, and communication for players and dungeon masters on both sides. This is perhaps the most useful tip by far, and it mostly comes down to the group's organization and communication skills, basically following the social contract. For a dungeon master, this comes down to keeping track of NPCs, names, and the like, but also keeping track of all the things that make a game work. Don't cut corners. Being well organized is a key skill for everyone at the table, especially if you give handouts to the players, like homebrew critical hit and fumble tables, house rule lists, you name it. Make sure you keep track of the characters' backstories too. Your players will love you for this. The communication part of it, however, is just letting people know, most importantly the dungeon master, in advance if you happen to be unable to make it to the next game. Mainly because your DM needs to know that so they can plan something for Billy not being able to make the session this week. If you communicate not just schedules, but possible issues with rulings, the direction of the game, etc., sure, it'll be awkward for a few minutes at the table, but at least you don't get burned out of the game, or worse, start being disruptive at the table. No one likes that sort of player. Don't be that guy. Good communication is a way around all that mess. Potentially, at least. One last thing for Dungeon Masters, if you have players showing up to sessions week after week, or however often your group gets together, take that in stride. Whether you realize it or not, you have done something right. And you have the players chomping at the bit for more of the campaign. Anyways, as always, this has been Kenneth Woody, your humble Dungeon Master, signing off. Stay nerdy, guys.